Um, Good morning. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Tim Carey. I'm part of the Secretariat for the Citizens' Assembly, and there's a lot of lovely memories flooding back, seeing so many of the speakers, so many of the members, some of the members of the Expert Advisory Group, the Steering Group, the Secretariat, the media. It's like the gang's all here again. And it's lovely, and I think it speaks to the interest that people have had in this Assembly and the interest that they will have in the outcomes of the recommendations that they've made. The format for this morning is fairly simple. Our wonderful chairperson, Evie Nahuelwan, will give a presentation, Dr. Evie Nahuelwan will give a presentation on the report and its findings and recommendations. Following that, we've delighted that two members of our steering group, who are representative of the members of the Assembly, have agreed to speak briefly about their experiences of the Assembly. There will then be an opportunity for questions and answers. That's really for the stakeholders, members of the Assembly, and other interested parties. The media, the speakers will be available for questions and answers afterwards separately. So if we can just keep the first questions and answers just for the stakeholders and the members. So I think without further ado, I'll hand you over to our chairperson, Dr. Evie Nahuelwan.
Thank you very much, Tim, and it is lovely to see so many familiar faces here today and such great interest in this report and the recommendations that the citizens have made in this Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss. Now, I haven't made a presentation in the 10 months that we had an Assembly, and my inner educator is coming to fruition today, because this is really almost a crash course in the work that we did, and then I'll introduce you to some of the recommendations that the members have made today. But hopefully for those here today and online, it'll provide a good starting point for the conversation that we really need to have now in Ireland around biodiversity loss and how we should start to protect it, conserve it and restore it. So for anyone who isn't familiar, what is a Citizens' Assembly? They're tools of deliberative democracy, and what they do is they deliver reflective, informed opinion on a particular issue. It's a way of having conversations on complex issues. People talk, people listen, and I think our Citizens' Assembly did that incredibly well. There were moments of tension, moments of absolute disagreement, but throughout the conversations that were happening, the room came to a consensus, and that's what you see in the report today, the recommendations that these fantastic 99 members came to an agreement on. As we know, in Ireland, citizens' assemblies can render formally blocked situations finally governable, but it's led to great transformational change in our country. If we think of the referendums that we've had recently, in terms of the marriage referendum, the referendum on repealing the Eighth Amendment, the Citizens' Assembly on Climate Change led directly to the Climate Act in 2021. We'll have an upcoming referendum on the place of the woman and the wife in the home, which, as I stand here working today, I hope that will get taken out in November. But citizens' assemblies have brought about those conversations, and they've brought about those societal changes, and I'm confident that this Citizens' Assembly will follow in that line and have the same legacy. There's a high level of public awareness, which is great, because the research will show that when the public know and are interested in something, that's generally when it will come about, and so I'm delighted that there's such interest in today. The citizens in this assembly were chosen slightly differently to other assemblies. This wasn't based on who is on the electoral register. This just went out to 20,000 households, and the letter to the household, they decided who in the household would go and represent the house at the assembly. And apparently there were rows in some houses over who could actually take that position up. But I think it's a real indicator of how engaged Irish people are in their own civil society, because of the 20,000 invitations that went out, over 2,300 people put up their hand and said, yes, I am willing to put myself forward for this important civic duty. And 99 people were then chosen out of those 2,300 based on CSO statistics. So we have the gender split. We had 12 to 18, or 18 to 24-year-olds, and 12 people over 65, all representative of the Irish population. I was delighted that I met 4 female software engineers in that room of 99, which I thought was quite impressive. We had farmers, we had fishers, and I think it was a good snapshot of Irish society, a great room to be part of. We even had one Ukrainian member, which I think is reflective of what Ireland looks like now, which is great to have. So these are our members that we had in our Citizens' Assembly. We had our 6 members of a steering group who are all here today, I believe, and you'll be hearing from Dan and Anka a little later on. We had an expert advisory group who guided us in choosing who we might have to present, who we might invite, and how our programme might look. And as I said, there was a huge amount of interest in the work. We had 647 submissions from Ireland and from around the world. I put in a snapshot there of a video that we had from Ecuador, and it was a shout out to the Assembly members to please consider nature in all of these conversations and the rights that it may have. We had 87 speakers, and they included 23 from NGOs, 16 from agriculture, 11 from state and government agencies, 10 speakers from universities, 8 talks by the Expert Advisory Group, 6 members of the Children's and Young People's Assembly on Biodiversity Loss, which happened in tandem, and 4 from local authorities. A lot of information was given to the Assembly over those 10 months, and it's a real credit to the members who took in all of that, who did incredible amounts of homework, and who took on all of that information to deliberate. We were the first Assembly to go on a field trip, and I really think that contributed to members' understanding of seeing policies working in practice and what we can do in whatever aspect of life we work in that can have an impact. And I'm incredibly grateful to all of these members who gave up their time, they interrogated the information, they shared their opinions, they listened respectfully to one another, they came up with ways that we might actually resolve this crisis of biodiversity loss. And I hope no one takes offence with the photos that I picked out there. But, you know, there was a lot of fun had too, and friendships were forged. I'm sorry, Felicity, it was a great photo, I couldn't resist using it. There was a great sense of community there. But I think it's important to point out that no one got away easily. Like, the questions that were asked to our presenters were tough, and some of the conversations were tense. And that was a real strength of the Assembly, that we felt that trust in the room, that we could provoke and poke and ask and question and consider. And I think you can see that reflected now in the 159 recommendations that we're presenting today. From the very start, we learned what biodiversity is. It's all life on Earth, and it's all the systems that underpin it. It's really difficult to find an image that can encapsulate what biodiversity is. What I've taken away from it is that it's an interconnected system, and if you take one piece of it out, the system will fall apart. Dr. Jane Goodall, who addressed it at the end, she actually considered it as a tapestry, and it's apt. We have 2 tapestries here. She said if you keep pulling the threads from the tapestry, it's okay for a while, but you'll find that one thread and the whole thing will come apart. And she said that's what we're doing right now. That's the biodiversity crisis that we're in. And I have also reflected that, you know, when I was asked to take on this role, I first of all didn't want to because I don't know enough about it, I thought, and I learned so much, and I learned that we can each play a role in protecting the environment. But what I also realised is that the greens of our beautiful countryside mask the loss that we are experiencing, and that we need to look a little bit harder around us to see what are we losing, what isn't there anymore. That's biodiversity loss. Thankfully, biodiversity is something we can impact individually, in our local community groups, in our local authorities. This is a hopeful thing because we can actually start to reverse that if we all decide to work together on it now. However, at this point, it's quite depressing where we are. By 2050, it's projected that only 10% of the Earth will be in a near natural state. In the next 100 to 150 years, 13% of all species will be threatened with extinction. At least 1/3 of protected species in Ireland are declining in population. A quarter of our regularly occurring bird species are in long-term decline. Birds that overwinter are down by 50% since the 1990s. And the endemic species that we have, and you see some of them here, are in particular concern. We're consistently losing our hedgerows, we heard, which is the life source of the country. We have the lowest forest cover in Europe, and only 2% of our land has native broadleaf trees. Only 20% of cultural land is managed for biodiversity, and we know that monoculture forests contribute to biodiversity loss, as does the management practices of forests that we see now. Almost 30% of our semi-natural grasslands have been lost in the last decade. 85% of protected habitats in Ireland are in unfavourable condition. Less than half of our marine environment can be described as healthy, and we're an island nation. Our peatlands, they improve and regulate water. They're a hugely important carbon store, but they are incredibly vulnerable habitats, and we continue to damage them. The majority of our agricultural soil is in suboptimal state. It's contaminated by nitrates and phosphates, and nitrate is particularly challenging because it goes into the groundwater in freely draining land and then estuaries, and we heard that that was particularly a problem in the south coast. And there's been a huge drop, we heard, in water quality since 2015 when milk quotas for dairy farming were dropped. The decline of our fresh water systems was the most depressing thing, in my opinion, that we heard over the 10 months. The number of near pristine river sites have declined from 500 in the 1980s to 32 today. 20 to 30% of freshwater biodiversity are vulnerable or worse. And we're at a tipping point because if we don't start acting now, that access to fresh water that we really take for granted, we won't have that anymore. And everybody will have their own personal story about this. You might have seen on the first slide, I had a picture of a lake and a boat, and that's the lake closest to me, Loch Cara. It's a marl lake, but it's being destroyed by all of the pollutants that are going into it. There used to be far more fish in it than there is now. And we can see that in also the Corrib, where I usually enjoy fishing, there's just less mayflies, and that's a real indicator of the ecosystem surrounding the lakes. Everybody will have their own personal story about this. If you think about it, you'll see the link. And I think that brings us nicely to the first two recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly, that the state has to now take prompt, decisive, urgent action to address biodiversity loss and restoration. It has to provide leadership, protecting Ireland's biodiversity for future generations. The statistics that I told you there are happening now. They are only going to get worse. We are going in the wrong direction. And so we have to think about the legacy that we're leaving for our future generations. This Assembly believes that the state has comprehensively failed to adequately fund, implement and enforce existing national legislation, national policies, EU biodiversity-related laws and directives, and this must change. The least we can do is abide by our own laws. And so, in that depressing state, very nicely broken by the 15-minute bell here in the Bank of Ireland, we don't have to feel hopelessness and we don't have to feel anxiety, because the Assembly has come up with a blueprint of what we need to do next. And that's where I think we can come out of this with a really positive, good news story. We can all do something. Liam saved lives by not killing the jackdaws in his garden after being part of this Citizens' Assembly. And so what we need to do as a matter of urgency is really protect the land that is specifically protected, and to do that with management plans and by resourcing the right areas that we can. And as I said, not break our own laws. I'm not going to go through 159 recommendations. You can see it in the report there in front of you, but there's a lot there to be interrogated that we can look at individually in groups and local authorities. Agriculture accounts for almost 70% of our land area, and farmers are at the heart of the solution to this. And I'm so delighted that we have farmers with us here today for the launch of this report. Farmers can be mobilised at scale because they see themselves as custodians of the land. It's the most important thing that farmers want, is to hand over their land in good condition. So we have to support them with the right policies. We can't subsidise unsustainable agricultural practices. We need to use our money to subsidise sustainable practices. And we heard that directly from farmers. And I think the farmers that spoke to us from across many different farm associations, they'll probably see their recommendations mirrored directly in the report today. The Assembly is also asking that Ireland take its global responsibility to heart and consider why GDP is a goal in itself, while we're always looking at growth without actually paying nature for the growth that it is responsible for. And so it asks here that we should shift an emphasis in the EU and international economic policy away from GDP expansion as a goal in itself and towards the goal of societal and ecological well-being. I mean, it speaks to the enormity of thought that went into this complex subject that the Assembly have this recommendation in the very top recommendations that are there. I mentioned about the state of the freshwaters. We urgently need to protect them. We are at a tipping point, we heard, and there are a number of key recommendations related to this made by the Assembly, and many of those are related to agriculture as well. We can't expect Quilta to do better in biodiversity terms if they're doing it as a commercial enterprise, and so the Assembly has suggested that the 1988 Forestry Act be reassessed to ensure that Quilta have looking after biodiversity at the core of what they're going to do, and that state-owned woodlands should be recognised and managed as a strategic, long-term national asset for the benefit of the common good. As I said, our peatlands, they're a massive carbon resource, something we need to be conserving better. We heard in this section of presentations that the problem isn't necessarily a problem of turf, but it's a problem of heating. And we need to make sure that we are paying people who are relying on turf to heat their homes adequately. That the people who are come from the peatlands are proud of the bog and they want to be part of the next chapter. So we need to make sure that we're considering that and considering the just transition. We heard that 70% of the population of the world will live in cities by 2050. And in that regard, we need to make sure that we're looking after our urban spaces. And so the Assembly recommended that there should be more green spaces that support biodiversity in urban areas, and with that looking at An Bord Pleanála and taking local authority legislation. With resourcing as well, we heard from speakers from other European cities who have enormous teams looking after green spaces in urban areas, and we need to do that, bring it to a higher priority in our local authorities. The Constitution is the law that governs a land, but unfortunately our Constitution doesn't actually refer to the land. And our members have suggested that, in line with international trends in this area, that there should be a referendum to amend the Constitution with a view to protecting biodiversity, specifically to look at human substantive environmental rights. This has already been declared by the UN as a human right, the right that a person has to a clean and healthy, safe environment. Members of this Assembly are suggesting this be put into our own constitution with procedural rights, which means that I can access the information that I require to see if I have that access to a clean and healthy, safe environment. They also considered that nature should have substantive rights within the Constitution, and basically what that means is that, similar to a company having rights, perhaps a forest should have those rights, a lagoon should have those rights, an estuary should have those rights. Again, we wouldn't be the first people to come up with it. This is already happening in Spain. They're looking at constitutional amendments in Germany, in Holland. It's already happening that parks and rivers have these rights in New Zealand. It's in the Constitution in Ecuador and Bolivia. Really what we're doing here is going back to the old laws that we had in this country to say we respect nature because we know we depend on it. If we protect nature, we are protecting ourselves. So this is a whistle-stop tour of some of the recommendations that are in this report. For me, I think it's most important that we undertake this action now so that our children and our grandchildren will be able to live on this planet. It's something that is brought home to me immensely now with my own 2 young boys, that when we go out, we're really respecting the nature around us. We're helping the bees. We're looking forward to seeing more of it around us. If we don't take action now, we will not have this beautiful country in a healthy state to give to our children, to give to our grandchildren. I got a commitment from the Taoiseach yesterday that this report will go to an Oireachtas committee before the summer recess and will report back by the end of this year. And that's the type of action that we need to see. But it's not alone government that need to act on this. It's individuals, it's community groups, it's local authorities. So I hope they can each look at these blueprints and see what actions they can take themselves without waiting for overarching policy to ask them. So with that, I thank you sincerely all for being here today. I thank sincerely the members for all of the time that they've put into this, and I'm looking forward now to seeing how Ireland will move forward in conserving and restoring biodiversity. Gormagh.
So it was nearly exactly a year ago when the Secretariat, many of whom are here today, and the members, many of whom are here today, were preparing for their first inaugural meeting. It was a busy year. The members heard 13 hours of presentations. They discussed in roundtable discussions what they heard for 21 hours and 30 minutes. They engaged speakers in 6 hours of questions and answers. They took 9 hours for plenary sessions, and they were on a 7-hour field trip. So I suppose the first question I would like to ask one of our members of the steering group who are central, as all the members were, to the process is, so Dan, why did you put up your hand for this?
Thanks, Tim. I'm delighted to be here today, and I'm delighted to have been part of the Assembly, to be honest with you all. My motivation for being involved in the Assembly, I suppose, stems back to my own childhood. I grew up in a small village in Wicklow, and it would have been a case of going out to school in the morning. There'd be rabbits at the end of the garden, you'd see those. We would have spent our weekends walking in the hills in the Frocken Glen and up towards Lugnaquilla. And in the summertime, we would have spent our long summer evenings getting eaten alive by midges. That was my childhood memories, and now I'm a father to 2 small children, and I would hope that the environment they live in is similar to the one that I grew up in, that the same rich biodiversity is there, that they'll get to experience the same things that I experienced. And I think with the effect of biodiversity loss over the last number of decades, things are in decline, and we're starting to see less around us and less of the rich biodiversity that we would have encountered before. I'm lucky enough that I live even further out in the countryside now. We live in a very rural area, and we're blessed that we have deer that come to visit us in the garden. We have a badger set at the end of the garden, and it's great for me to be able to tell my kids about that. And those dreaded midges, they do come every summer, but the bats that live in the old buildings around us, they feed on those. And it's important to understand that while not everything in nature is very nice for us humans, it's there for a reason. And it's very important that we recognise that and that we respect that. One of the speakers that spoke to us at one of the early meetings was Roman Sarnik, and I hope I'm getting the name right. And one of the main things that I took away from his talk was that we all aspire to be good ancestors. And by that I mean that the things that we do now, while we may not see the effect straight away, in generations to come, the things that we do now will have a great effect. Similar to with climate change, if we don't act now, it may all be lost. So I would encourage people to have a look at the report and to read through it and to see the recommendations and see what they can do in their own lives to be a good ancestor to the generations that will come afterwards. I grew up in a house where we were always encouraged to be civic-minded and to get involved in things in our community. And when we came of voting age, it was always a recommendation to vote often and early, was the joke, but it was always to make sure that your vote counted and make sure that you have your say in what's going on in your locality and in your environment. There's great work going on at European level to do with the environment. Hopefully, following our report to the government and the recommendations therein, there'll be great work that comes out of that at a national level. But we also need to remember that at a local level, there's a lot of work we can do. It's great to see that so many of the local authorities are now advertising and hiring biodiversity officers, and that's fantastic to see. It's great to see that attention has been put on that at a local level. And also when it comes to the local elections in 2024, next year there's local elections, that when people come canvassing at our doors, that we're familiar with the recommendations that are in the report. And we ask the people that are going to represent us on a local level what they plan to do in terms of biodiversity and how to maintain it and to reverse the damage that's already been done in our local area. I suppose that's my main motivation, was just to kind of make sure that I could have my say, and I was delighted to be part of the 100 citizens that represented the people of Ireland, to have our say, to get our voice heard, and that hopefully the government will take on our recommendations.
Thank you, Dan. And now, working on a citizens' assembly, people are really curious about it. How does it work? How's the process? What's it like? What's it like in the room? So, Anke, you were in a room with 100 other people for much of last year and part of this year. What was that experience like for you?
Well, for me, I think it's a once-in-a-lifetime extraordinary experience to be a member on the Citizens' Assembly. I think, like most members, I took it as a challenge, and to see if we can explore ways to tackle this urgent crisis facing us, and to preserve biodiversity and to protect it. And during the first stage, when we heard all the experts speak and present all the figures and present the status of biodiversity in Ireland, I think all of us felt a little bit shocked at the numbers. We knew that we were there to find solutions for a problem, but we didn't know how big the problem would be. And I think we all felt a bit stressed because the task ahead was daunting and seemed very difficult. But the second part, the part with the discussions and brainstorming and debating, was the most enriching and inspiring of them all. Everybody was very respectful of others' opinions and ideas. They were willing to share from their experience. A lot of members had a lot more experience than I had with the topic, and they were willing to debate and negotiate and sometimes even change their minds after hearing all the points of view. And I think that restored our confidence that even though the process will be a long, laborious one, the outcome will be positive. And in the end, the part that impressed me most was writing the recommendations. It might seem the most tedious part of them all, but it impressed me because the members seemed so dedicated and so determined to hone and refine the words, to express our effort throughout the year. And it was gripping and inspiring. That's why we added one more session to our assembly to make sure we get everything exactly as we debated and we discussed it. And post-assembly, I think the general feeling is one of collective achievement and of faith that with clear guidelines, people will put biodiversity first and will put sustainable living first. And it's not enough just to talk about it and write about it. We also have to act, as Dan said, and Evan as well. So biodiversity needs us all to be its advocates, from politicians to businesses to households and even children. And they had their recommendations as well. So it was one of the greatest experiences I had I would say in the last 10 years, but my son is 9, so I'll say in the last 8 years. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
So that brings us to the end of this part. I don't know if there's any questions that people have about the report or the recommendations or the process or anything. I think we've...
Madam Chairperson, Evie, I congratulate you and your team on this, what I would call a hard-hitting report, but I welcome it. One of the concerns I have, though, is a previous Citizens' Assembly report enabled the Climate Action Plan to be prepared and launched in December 2022. And when I read that draft, I was delighted because as an arable farmer, I saw where we were proposing to increase from 340,000 hectares to 400,000 hectares in the next 7 years. But within a short period of time after that launch, it has now become very evident because of, dare I say it, contradictions in government policy, that the basic raw material that we need to expand, i.e. land, and most of the land we use would be leased, is now becoming non-economic to go into because of a contradiction in the nitrates plan. So I'm concerned that all the hard work that will be done sometimes gets lost in translation when it goes into the Oireachtas to be implemented at ground level. But I'm very happy to be part of that contribution and I welcome it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question and for presenting to the Assembly during the work as well. It was really important actually that we got as many farming experiences and perspectives as possible in that. And we had a lot of robust conversations around nitrates and what is going into waters as a result of farming practices. What you'll see in the report is what the members came to from having constructive conversations and finding a consensus. I think now, yes, the challenge is to bring that to the departments and for them to have those same difficult conversations, but also with them bringing in all those different perspectives. If this is to go to an Oireachtas committee in the coming months, myself and other members will present that, and we'll be sure to emphasise and highlight the plight of different types of farmers, because we need to make sure that the arable farming is actually promoted as well, as much as you say it is. So thank you for the point. I will do my best now as an advocate now of this Citizens' Assembly to make sure that what we heard gets communicated as much as possible, and that part of the policies that might come out of this is that they will be coherent. I think one of the main recommendations here is that a national biodiversity action plan will be put on a statutory basis and should be aligned with the climate action plan, and hopefully that will go towards your point.
Anyone else? $159 recommendations. Yes, Karen.
Thank you very much. I think your overarching recommendations are just superb, and congratulate everybody who's been involved in that. I want to ask a question about the marine environment. Do you think that you had enough people from the marine environment, traditional users, like seaweed harvesters, like local people who might be living on islands and depending on fish there? Because as a marine ecologist, I am missing, I'm comparing the agriculture recommendations and the marine ones, and I would have liked to have seen something on aquaculture. I would have liked to have seen something on seaweed harvesting and a plan protection of that. So just to ask you, were these discussed but they didn't make it, or what happened?
Thank you for that question, Karen. I think we'd have to say that even though we took 10 months, we all recognised that even in that time, we actually didn't get to discuss as much as we wanted to. Biodiversity is such a complex issue. It spans so much, and there is so much detail that's required when you start looking at the different sectors. So while they're probably incredibly specific recommendations, likely more so than any other assembly, and part of that comes from, I think, members were so disappointed with failings that current laws and policies weren't being enacted that they wanted to give that detail. However, there was also a recognition that we didn't get to talk about everything. And that was an unfortunate limitation that we had to acknowledge at the very, very last meeting, which was an additional one that members wanted to have more time. So yes, Karen, there won't be everything there that everybody wanted, but I do think it's positive that the marine aspect is highlighted there. You can see the summaries of the talks that we heard that are there, and it's positive that there's already been a commitment from government that will have the marine protected areas of at least 30% coming in the near future. So yes, more work to do and always, but I think what this report does is actually start the conversations, and it brings those conversations to broader audiences than might otherwise consider. So I hope that that's at least hopeful.
I just add to that is that there's a number of recommendations about structures in government, in society, that there should be new structures to address biodiversity. And they're the places that, a lot of the things that couldn't have been captured in 10 meetings or 10 days and 159 recommendations. In a way, you were kind of scratching the surface, and in a way, we're getting very detailed. So it was a challenge, and it was a challenge from the very start of how you can assist 100 or 99 randomly selected people from the country to understand the complex and diverse issues in biodiversity loss, and to make recommendations, meaningful recommendations to the government. So it was a challenge, and that was recognised, but I think that the structures are recommended, if they're implemented, can address a whole plethora of other issues. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Is there a way for the Citizens' Assembly members on biodiversity loss to come back together to see how the government has enacted or implemented the changes so that they can continue to create pressure, I suppose, to keep it going, you know.
That's a great question, Caroline. It's great to see you back as well, as a friend of Merlin Woods. But that, interestingly, is a question that the Taoiseach had himself. Now, officially in the structures of citizens' assemblies in Ireland, the work is completed because the recommendations have been presented to the Oireachtas, and hence this citizens' assembly is technically dissolved. However, we had a really good conversation with Taoiseach Leo Varadkar yesterday. He had a lot of questions to ask about the report, and he gave it a lot of time. And he actually suggested that when government responds to the report, he would like to communicate that to members, and so we'll find a way of doing that. Traditionally, it's not something that will happen because, as I said, an assembly is dissolved, but I think you can hear from these members that they're incredibly passionate about it now. And, you know, people put in a lot of time into this. It should go somewhere. So, yeah, this has already been thought about. So thanks for that question, Caroline. And Dan behind, yeah.
Madam Chairman, and congratulations to everyone that took part in this assembly. I am part of ICSA, and we had stood outside the Dáil 2 weeks ago about the sheep sector. And the sheep sector is very important to the future of our country. And the sheep sector is totally on its knees at the moment, and I think the Minister is not prepared at the moment to do anything about it. There's 20 euros, 25 euros less the lamb is worth this year than last year, and the feed cost has gone up 25 euros, so that's almost 50 euros in the difference from this time last year to now. And as Pat here beside me also said, the sheep sector depends on rented land in some cases, and the nitrates directive has really turned the rented land on its head, and it's more than double what it was this time last year. So I think somebody should recommend that the government and the Minister listen to the sheep sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan, for that. And I know there's a lot of complexities within the agricultural system that need a lot of conversation. I think and I hope that one positive thing that can come out of the work of this Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss is that we can see that we can have constructive conversations about these challenges. I would hate to see what's happening in places like Holland, where farmers are seen as extremists against environmentalists. I would hate that to happen in Ireland, because I think we can come to a consensus space and have constructive conversations where we can all work together. As I said on this, farmers are key to biodiversity loss, to conserving it and restoring it. You're the ones who know how it all works, and you're the ones who are in the best position to do things about it. And I think there's bigger conversations to have here for sure about different types of farming. Pat was talking about the arable land, you're talking about the sheep farming, and I think we need to strive for that balance. It will make for difficult conversations, but I think one thing that we did well was we looked at equity in terms of farm association voices, not just equality. So even though some larger associations may seem to represent more of the farmers, I think more of the farmers actually need to have voices at the table. And so this is probably something that this Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss can't address, but hopefully there will be bigger, challenging conversations within other departments around that balance that we need to achieve to make sure that, yes, we're providing food, but we're also protecting the environment as much as we can.
Just add to that is that a number of the recommendations related to farmers and fishers was that there needs to be engagement with them the whole way, and that was really strongly emphasised through the recommendations that were voted on by the members.
Pat McCormack from the ICMSA. Look, I'd like to thank the Assembly, and in particular your chairperson, for the engagement. I had the honour of addressing your Assembly on one particular morning, and it was a good active engagement. I suppose equally, the one, and you touched on it there earlier in your initial presentation, we're part of the solution, and that's what we need to be seen as. But unfortunately, there was 2, maybe 3 decades of CAP that were hugely destructive to biodiversity and land eligibility. And thankfully, in 2023, that has been got right. While some in the room, indeed maybe all in the room, may say too little, too late, better late than never. We are on a path, I suppose, at this point in time. We see the nitrates and cow banding having an impact. We also see change in practice with regard animal nitrogen, organic nitrogen on farm, and the value that's put on that now in comparison to 3, 4, 5 years ago, and the efficiency in its use. And hopefully that change in practice will be delivered in biodiversity, but equally and maybe more importantly, on that particular note, water quality. But what I will say is we are part of the solution, and the local authorities need to do more than concentrate on biodiversity. There is a huge impact around local villages where there isn't sufficient wastewater treatment on water quality. And irrespective of the investment that a farmer makes on that particular water path, it cannot be done without the investment from the local authorities. So it's very much a together in order to hand over the countryside to the next generation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pat, and thank you for being here this morning. I think this is really constructive that we have so many of the farm associations here represented to want to work for biodiversity. I think, Pat, you made a great point in your presentation that why is it restricted? Why can't more farmers join in and get funding for biodiversity conservation on their farm? And you'll see that reflected in this 159. You'll also see, Pat, that there is recommendations from members that Irish Water need to invest more in those structures. So I really think that's where members kind of came to the fore, and thinking about this in a bigger picture. This isn't finger pointing, it's about working together. And I think what we say in the text, we try and highlight that it's policies that farmers were asked to farm that are to blame. And this is where the policies now need to be supporting farmers to conserve biodiversity. So I'm hopeful that that's in the report.
Okay.
Thank you. Alan Moore from Hedgerows Ireland Group. We made a submission to the Assembly, and we're delighted to see that so many of the recommendations have been...
Sorry, could you stand up just for the camera here? So
Thank you. I'm Alan Moore from Hedgerows Ireland Group. We made a submission to the Assembly, and we're delighted to see that the importance of hedgerows were so clearly reflected in your recommendations. We will be using your recommendations as we advocate to the Minister for Agriculture to immediately change some of the regulations which unfortunately are facilitating hedgerow removal for a small number of largely investment-style landowners. But we will also be using the recommendations to help with the promotion and the advertisement of all the many values of hedgerows. So thank you for your work. It's been very helpful to hedgerows, I believe.
Thanks, Alan, and it's the members that really wanted hedgerows front and centre. And I see Shirley Clerk and Heritage Officer from County Monaghan, and it was one of her presentations where she described hedgerows as the blood supply system of the country, and that we're losing it so much. So I think it speaks to all of the presentations that members really listened to and brought those points forward into it. They're so visible here now, so I'm really glad to hear that the report can be used by groups like yourself now to go forward with that.
And speaking of Shirley, if you could stand up, Shirley, that'd be great.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Chairperson, and thank you so much to all of the Assembly members. I'm so delighted to be here today. I've worked for 25 years and more in this area, and sometimes you can be quite despondent about the biodiversity crisis that we're in, and that the issues are becoming so polarised, and then it becomes very difficult to have a constructive conversation about them. So I think that this form of deliberative democracy has really shown how, when we get the time to consider the issues, hear evidence and facts, and not just rhetoric, that we can actually drill down into the detail and, really come up with superb recommendations. And I hope that we're at a watershed moment for maybe how we discuss more of the issues going forward. And I'm particularly interested perhaps in maybe we could have citizens' assemblies for biodiversity at the local level, because the Irish countryside is a very diverse place. We've lots of different farming systems and different intensities of farming, and indeed different villages and different landscapes and geology and rivers and coasts and everything. So I think it would be a fantastic model to allow us to discuss these issues at a very sensible approach, to drill right down into the detail and to come up with solutions at that very local level as well, so that we can build on this fantastic work that the Citizens' Assembly has undertaken. And I really want to thank the members who gave so freely of their time. I'm in awe of you all, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Shirley.
Thanks, Shirley.
I'm just going to respond to Shirley and volunteer all the members to go talk to their local community groups and men's sheds and schools, etc., because everybody was so proud of the work that we did, and we have a slide deck together now that members can go and talk to their local communities. But I think it's so key, and it was something that again came across in the recommendations, Shirley, and particularly actually in agriculture, that solutions cannot be thought of nationwide because the countryside is incredibly different going from a couple of miles down the road to another. So we'd need to think about local solutions.
Rebecca? Oh, sorry. No, not Rebecca.
Elaine.
Sorry.
I'm Elaine McGough from Antashka. And I just wanted to say, those of us who work in the biodiversity and the climate space, it can often be incredibly depressing day to day. The news isn't good. But today, this report gives me hope. I see it as the beginning of a long overdue and very necessary discussion. It's not going to be easy, but it's a discussion that has to be had. And I want to very much thank the Citizens' Assembly for starting this discussion, for laying out the facts so clearly. And I really hope that the government is listening today, because you have spoken for the Irish people and you could not have been clearer. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Elaine.
Thanks, Elaine. And I just want to respond to that by saying it was the Oireachtas also that set this up in last February, and there were no votes against it. You know, the members of the Oireachtas voted to have this Citizens' Assembly, and they asked members to do this work, which they've done so excellently well, and now we've given it back to the Oireachtas. So it's not a civic project. This is coming from the state. The state recognises the problems and have asked for solutions to consider, and I think what the members have given here is that. Dan?
Just on the recommendations themselves, there's a breakdown at the end of the report on our voting on the different recommendations, and I know from my own point of view, I would have had certain ideas and thoughts on the area before I came to the Assembly, and would have felt very strongly in some areas and wouldn't have known a whole lot about other areas. And throughout the course of all the meetings, my own opinions changed through speaking with the other people on the Assembly, been at a different table at every meeting and getting the benefit of the rich diversity of people in the room. And I think by looking at the breakdown of the voting at the end of the report, you'll see that while there's 159 recommendations, we all got a chance to have an input into those, to take on board what was said to us in the room and at the meetings, and to put our words into the report and to make sure that what we felt should be in the report is in the report, and then to get to vote on it. And you can see there is a broad, on some subjects we were unanimous, on other subjects we weren't. And that's down to the broad diversity of people in the room and the people that we heard from. And I think what I'd like to point out is that this report it's representative of the 100 people that were in the room, the 99 citizens and the chair, Evie, and our views on the subject. And the fact that we all do come from different backgrounds, we all have different histories and different upbringings and different day-to-day lives, and that it's important that it's taken that the 159 recommendations that are in that report are our voice, and they're intended to be the voice of the people of Ireland, not just the 100 people that were in the room. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Ian?
Hi, Ian Talbot from the Irish Chambers of Commerce. I'm struck by the fact the last event we had before COVID, we were in this room with Mary Robinson, where we launched a pledge by our 39 affiliated chambers to respect and promote the Sustainable Development Goals. And by coincidence, last month we had a dinner. Thank goodness we're back doing dinners and things again. But we had the Taoiseach and we had Mary Robinson again, and she gave us an update reminder of our pledge. But she actually said, while she appreciates what we're doing, we need to do 10 times more. She kept saying 10 times, 10 times. So it could be 100. I'll let you away with 10. So business is increasingly aware of the challenges that we have ahead of us. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to the Assembly. It was very enlightening. And I suppose maybe in that period of COVID, maybe we all got a chance and an opportunity to appreciate more our local biodiversity and our 2 to 5 kilometre walks and so on. So I think there's a lot going in our favour at the moment. But I can't tell you just how important it is. You know how important it is that we get government on board to give us information and guidance and recommendations. Businesses are anxious to do stuff to help, but they also need information about what the right thing to do is. And I'm delighted to see so much engagement. So, for example, I see my own local authority, Fingal, represented here with Kevin Halpenny, who does a fantastic job in the parks in Fingal. But we need that information and content coming through from government and from local government to see what needs to be done locally. But I can assure you we will do what we can to persuade our members that supporting these recommendations is an absolute essential, something we have to do. Thank you.
That's great, Ian, and thank you for being here today. And I think, as you'll see, the sectors are all referenced and mentioned here. And I think one specific one is that members have said, a lot of industry, a lot of businesses have really come to the fore in tackling climate change. And now if they can bring biodiversity with that. And I think thinking about sustainability in the broad sense helps that. And perhaps, the Business for Biodiversity presentation that we also had throughout the course of the Assembly, those initiatives will hopefully be able to support businesses here. But it's so great to see all the different perspectives in this room reflecting all the different perspectives that we heard throughout the course of the work. I think it's really promising. Thanks for being here.
Okay, I think maybe on that very positive note, we'll bring proceedings to a close. I'd like to thank you for your attendance, your attention, your questions, and I'd like to thank our three speakers for three brilliant speakers giving their very different perspectives on the Assembly. Thank you.
And enjoy communicating the recommendations and the report to as many people as possible, please. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.